afternoon. I'm so happy to be here today presenting this very timely panel entitled The Impending Eviction Crisis, Housing as Healthcare and Racial Justice. Today's panel is sponsored by the ABA Section for Civil Rights and Social Justice. It is one of many rapid response webinars in the series that they are currently planning and promoting. You can learn more about this on their website. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A, not the chat function. If you're not seeing those controls, ensure your screen isn't idle. We will be holding space to answer questions at the end of the program. And we'll also be recording this program today. So you'll be sent a link to the recording and you'll be able to share that with all of your networks. So with that, I am excited to begin today's program and introduce the panelists for today's panel, The Impending Eviction Crisis, Housing as Healthcare and Racial Justice. So first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Yost. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am a law clerk with the Homeless Persons Representation Project in Baltimore. And now I'll turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Alieza Durana. My pronouns are she, her, and ella, and I'm a policy journalist and media strategist with the Eviction Lab at Princeton University.
Hi.
Sorry. Go ahead, Emily.
I am a visiting associate clinical professor of law and the director of the Health Justice Advocacy Clinic at Columbia Law School. And I had the great fortune of partnering with the Eviction Lab to create the housing policy scorecard during COVID-19. And I'm tracking eviction moratoriums across the country, looking for best practices.
Hi, I'm Charisse Liu, and I am a housing attorney with the Public Justice Center, the Human Right to Housing team. And we've been working with trying to get the right to counsel, fighting COVID evictions, and putting a moratorium on evictions, and trying to cancel rent.
Good afternoon, I'm Armen Merjian. I am the senior staff attorney at Housing Works in New York and the legal director of the HIV Law Project, also part of Housing Works in New York, and I am a civil rights and poverty lawyer. Welcome. Oh, and he, him, his are my pronouns.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to start screen sharing a PowerPoint, and we'll start by going over a brief agenda for today's webinar. And we'll also be hearing from an impacted So today, we're going to hear from LM, an impacted tenant, who will be sharing her story and providing some context for the scope of how large this problem really is. LM, are you able to turn on your microphone? Hello.
Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've spoken with Charisse, and she said that you would be willing to share a little bit about what your experience has been like. I'm having a little trouble hearing you, I'm sorry.
Could she call in?
All right, so let's come back. We'll circle back to this and we can troubleshoot the audio. So back to the So today we'll be discussing briefly, just to further set the tone, the American Bar Association's policy, Resolution 117 was adopted by the ABA in August of 2013, and it recognized that policy encourages local government to promote measures like security of tenure to support the adoption of principles recognizing that housing is a human right and to prevent the infringement of that right. And it's from this space and this framework that we are beginning today's conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alieza and Emily. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on today. And do let me know if you have any issues with the audio quality on my end. But Emily and I are going to talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of inequality and eviction prior to COVID, and then I'm going to turn it over to Emily to speak about some of the trends that we're seeing as people respond to COVID-19, both in terms of the housing crisis and the housing crisis. We can go to the next slide, please. So just by way of background, for those of you that are less familiar with the Eviction Lab, we are a research institute at Princeton University. And in 2016, we built the first nationwide database of evictions in America. This was in part came out of my colleague Matthew Desmond's dissertation research in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that found that evictions were a much more widespread phenomenon than was commonly thought. And so we have roughly 83 million court records from between 2000 and 2016. We're hoping to release 2017 data, 2018 data later this summer. I think that we've had a request just to mute other audio as well. So we have formal eviction records from 48 states and the district, and we clean those records, validate, geocode them, and make them available for sociological research and the public as well. So you can go to the next slide, please. So part of the impetus for making, again, as I mentioned, the database was to make an invisible problem visible, and this is largely to two trends from the last 3 decades that have really caused economic insecurity to many American families around the US. And those 2 of those trends are the combination of rising rents and also stagnant wages. You can go to the next slide, please. So this is just a graph detailing median household income from the US Census Bureau. And as you can see, this is sort of disaggregated by educational attainment of the household. And since the early 90s, incomes have barely risen. And at the same time, we've seen rents rise across the United States. Okay, click the next slide, please. So while we know anecdotally that rents have risen in places like New York and San Francisco, what's less commonly known is that rents have also risen in the Midwest, in the South, and in places in the West that are less commonly thought of. And what the result of that has just been is that families are contributing more and more of each paycheck towards rent, leaving less and less money for other important family budget items, but also less money for savings and wealth building, particularly in communities of color where structural racism has affected the ability to grow wealth at the family level for many, many decades at this point. If you can go to the next slide, please. So how big of a problem is eviction? In 2016, the Eviction Lab saw 3.7 million eviction cases filed. That comes to about 7 each minute. So in an average year, we see more eviction filings annually than we saw foreclosures at the height of the Great Recession. And again, this is a phenomenon that disproportionately affects Black families and communities of color as a direct result of systemic racism in our housing market. And again, for those of you less familiar with eviction or foreclosure, an eviction is a landlord-initiated involuntary move that can happen to renters, whereas a foreclosure is an involuntary move that a bank or lending agency initiates to repossess a home from a homeowner. Next slide, please. Eviction is also a phenomenon that transcends geography. It transcends political ideology. It is a phenomenon that we see across the United States in red and blue states. It's something that occurs in rural, suburban, and urban areas. And when we first published our database, we actually saw that some of the top 10 most evicting cities in America were places in the southeastern United States, in the Midwest, and in the Rust Belt, places that have been greatly affected by the Great Migration. So thinking about the legacy of slavery, of laws created to support property owners, particularly in the South. And that really is reflected in the rates of eviction that we see across the southeastern United States. You can see that, in Richmond, Virginia, 1 in 9 renters was evicted in 2016. Tulsa, Oklahoma is also an eviction hotspot. And so this is not just an urban problem in New York City, it is a problem that occurs more broadly in the United States and to devastating consequences to families and communities around the United States. Next slide, please. And, unfortunately, even, prior to COVID-19, when unemployment was under 5%, 3/4 of renting families below the poverty line were unable to receive housing assistance. And that is due to a couple of reasons. One is just that, the United States has been underfunding its housing assistance budget for many, many years now. So the pot of money towards rental assistance is quite small. And in addition to that, many states and localities have put into place punitive requirements that make it very difficult for individuals and families to access that money. So, now that we're seeing unemployment rise to levels equivalent to the bleakest years of the Great Depression, we are anticipating a rise in evictions and homelessness, given the increasing pressure that families are under through no fault of their own. Next slide, please. This is just another slide detailing data from the American Housing Survey showing that most low-income renting families devote over half of their income to housing. And next slide. And finally, this is data that we are in the process of publishing as well, that just as context for how much money are families typically evicted for, this data comes from the state of Virginia. And for over 1/3 of families, they are evicted for less than 1 month's rent. So 1 in 2 evictions were for less than $940. So it's not as if, renters are racking up large amounts of rental debt. It usually is the result of, let's say if a person didn't get enough hours from their job and were only able to pay partial rent, or again, through no fault of their own. So it's a helpful reminder that this is a very sort of devastating phenomenon that happens at a very low economic threshold. So the next slide, I know that I mentioned before that the publicly available data that we have is largely between 2000 and 2016. When the pandemic started, the Eviction Lab put together an effort to stand up a web scraper so that we could better understand eviction as a phenomenon during the pandemic. So we have been working with a firm called January Advisors to scrape court filings data from a select number of cities across the country. So this is a new eviction tracking system that has never existed before, but we're working with 11 preliminary sites and are hoping to expand those sites so that we can understand how many filings are occurring in real time across the United States. Our initial sites were selected based on 2 categories. It was places that we already had historical data, so we had a baseline for comparison, and it was also sites where the court system had the ability for us to scrape their records. As some of you may know, there are municipal court systems that keep paper records still. So, while this is an effort that we would like to expand to all municipal courts, at this point in time, we have 11 partners. Look at the next slide. So this is just a snapshot from our website. These are some of the first sites that we have partnered with to scrape filings data. So, right now, what we're seeing so far is that, evictions were occurring as normal in January and February of 2020. And in March, we saw a precipitous drop off in filings. This was in part due to the eviction moratoria that were put into place around the country that Emily is going to speak further to in a moment. But what we have been seeing is that as these eviction moratoria lift, we start to see a rise in eviction filings. So Milwaukee, Wisconsin is probably the best example of this, unfortunately. The eviction moratorium in Wisconsin lifted at the end of May. And since then, we have seen eviction filings rapidly surpass historical averages in the state of Wisconsin. And in many of these other sites where you see that evictions are down, part of that is due to the fact that there are still moratoria in place. So part of the effort behind this was to have the system in place to be able to track when and how this avalanche of evictions occurs, so that policymakers and the courts can respond to try and prevent the removal of tenants from their communities. Next slide. So this is I'm going to give you just a brief snapshot. You all can explore this further on our website, but again, this is an example from Milwaukee. Milwaukee is one of the most segregated cities in America, and the site of my colleague Matt Desmond's book and dissertation research. It is, we think, a canary in the coal mine in terms of what we could possibly see around the country as emergency assistance expires and as these eviction moratoria lift. Next slide. And this is again what I was describing, that we saw January and February, we saw eviction filings close or above normal. They dropped off in March and April and May, and then skyrocketed up again in June. And this is something that we're seeing again in places that do not have eviction moratoria in place at the moment. And you can go ahead and skip forward 2 slides. I'm going to actually turn it over to my colleague Emily to talk a little bit more about eviction filings and what we've seen as a result of COVID-19. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alieza. Okay, so what are we looking at here? I wanted to give you a sense, sort of to emphasize what Alieza mentioned, that we were in a housing crisis before COVID-19 even started. So COVID-19 struck when 20.5 million families were already struggling to scrape the rent together, and only 1 in 4 eligible renters received financial assistance. So you saw that slide that Alieza showed, 75% of renters who qualify for housing subsidies do not receive one. So between the scarcity of federal housing assistance and the loss of over 4 million affordable housing units over the last decade, renters have been and are today increasingly vulnerable to eviction. 4 evictions were filed every minute in 2016, to give you some perspective, when the national unemployment rate was 4.7%. Today, with that being over 3 times that level and rising, we can expect to see more and more renters facing eviction. Next slide, please. So why do we think evictions are increasing? We are starting to see increased filing rates as the tracker is showing, and we're hearing this from courts as well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But also the evidence is there that we are on the brink of a major eviction crisis in the United States. Underscoring the immense toll of the pandemic, 50 million renters live in households that suffered COVID-19 related job or income loss. And 40% of that occurred in especially low-income households. These are households that were rent burdened to begin with and that were struggling to make the rent each month. In addition, the demand for financial assistance is at an all-time high. Researchers at Washington University have been tracking calls to 211 for rental assistance requests and other programs, and they found a 92% increase in requests for rental assistance from this time last year. At the same time, programs across the country that are just now starting to allocate rent relief funds through the CARES Act are being depleted within hours of being offered, and sometimes even within the hour. In addition, because the rent eats first, and most renters who are hard pressed to make the rent are shifting their food budget to the rent budget, food pantry requests have increased by as much as 2,000% in some states. Anecdotes and qualitative research has demonstrated the same, that many renters note out of one study in Maine that without food pantries, they wouldn't be able to make ends meet at all. In addition to that, many renters are stretched so threadbare right now that they're forced to take on credit card debt to pay the loans that's increased. And they are also taking out loan debt as well. So loans on their car, title, or something along those lines, just to pay the rent. According to the most recent US Census Bureau Housing Pulse survey that they do every week, over 31.6% of renters last week surveyed have slight or no confidence in their ability to pay the rent. So all of this combined tells us that we are really in the midst of an eviction crisis, and that we can already expect to see a surge in evictions. And this is demonstrated here. So you saw the eviction tracker system, which will start to tell us in real time what's happening in these cities. And then this is the estimation in many places. There are two studies that estimate the number of households facing eviction or at risk of eviction right now, and the estimates range from 20 to 28 million renters. The Michigan Court Administrative Office expects 75,000 eviction filings as soon as the moratoriums are lifted. 9,000 cases are currently pending in North Carolina, which motivated the court to put a pause on on eviction hearings in order to figure out how to process these cases equitably. In addition, in major cities from Los Angeles to New York City, upwards of 300,000 evictions are expected. When the moratorium in New York City lifted, housing advocates thought that they would see 50,000 evictions in one day. So across the country, tens and hundreds of thousands of evictions pending and really threatening to disrupt the housing market and to create mass homelessness across the country. Next slide, please. And you cannot talk about housing justice without talking about racial justice. And that is true as well with the eviction crisis that's currently happening. Housing groups expect that the majority of evictions will occur in communities of color. The housing crisis disproportionately is affecting Black and Latino renters, with 80% of people facing eviction without pandemic circumstances being among people of color. Today, 61% of Hispanic or Latinx and 44% of Black adults said that they or someone in their household had experienced a job or wage loss due to COVID-19, compared with 38% of white adults. A recent analysis by Covis and Analytics that job losses for Black workers are increasing more than any other group and rapidly. Nearly 3/4 of Black households and Latinx adults said that they do not have emergency funds to cover 3 months of expenses, whereas only around half of white adults said the same. In addition, one survey found that after controlling for education, Black households are more than twice as likely as white households to be evicted. We can expect all of these disparities that are widely proven to deepen as COVID-19 mortality and job loss affects communities of color at a much higher rate than other groups. And recent research even demonstrates that disproportionately Black communities and counties account for over half of the COVID-19 cases and 60% of all deaths. So all of this will expand and implode what we're already seeing in this renter crisis. Next slide, please. So moratoriums. So to comply with the COVID-19 social distancing requirements, courthouses across the nation closed to the public in March. This effectively placed all eviction proceedings on hold in the majority of states. At the same time, numerous governors, legislators, and mayors issued moratoriums on evictions through executive orders and emergency legislation, and that afforded varying levels of protection to renters. I wanted to show you this slide to point out that overwhelmingly, the moratorium originated from state courts. In fact, 93.3% of the states and territories, the courts are responsible for some or all of tenant protections against eviction. What this means is that the moment the courts reopen, and over 40%, almost 50% already have, these protections will lift. And the only thing remaining will be what the governor or the legislators put in place. So there's this patchwork that made up the moratoriums. Next slide, please. So many states, this is an overview of the different approaches to eviction moratoriums that the states have taken. And you can see at the bottom, 6 states left it to local discretion. So there was no state level moratorium throughout the pandemic. And across those states, renters were largely not protected. In the purple bars and the red bar, you can see those are the states where evictions have resumed, either remotely or in some cases in person. And in those states, courts are moving to larger settings like convention centers to process eviction cases. And then many of them are moving forward altogether. So the states limited some of their protections to tenants who can show COVID-19 related hardship. So this is an affirmative defense to an eviction that tenants are largely not aware of. In addition, the Federal CARES Act placed a moratorium on evictions of units receiving federal assistance. But because tenants are unaware of these rights, and because only today 15 states require that landlords certify compliance with the CARES Act, many of these tenants may be evicted without ever having the opportunity to be heard or to raise these affirmative defenses to eviction. This is an issue that's underscored by the fact that in the eviction setting, 10% of eviction cases, tenants are represented. Well, landlords are represented 90% of the time. So in 10% of eviction cases, tenants have representation. I wonder if you can hear my kids in the background. So this imbalance of representation leads to orders of eviction in the overwhelming majority of cases, even when tenants have this type of defense. Let's take a look at the next slide. So eviction can be divided into 5 stages: notice to tenant, filing of the eviction, the court hearing, and the order of eviction to the sheriff who's going to execute it. I want to mention this because I think the most effective moratoriums freeze the earliest stage in eviction, the notice to the tenant, so the initiation stage, because it avoids an eviction on the tenant's record, and it also provides the most amount of time for the tenant to pay arrears and for the state to work out how they're going to disperse federal rental assistance funds and get those to the people who need it the most. But like I showed you earlier, most states only relied on the suspension of hearings. And so that means that for a majority of these tenants, the eviction is already on their record. We'll go to the next slide. One constant across these policies is that they are temporary. Currently, there are numerous states with no state level eviction moratorium in place. And as the moratoriums lift, courts are reopening and moving to remote hearings. And by next week, there will be all of these states in yellow will no longer have state level protections for tenants. Some of these states do have local level protections, so it's important that tenants look locally and reach out to legal aid offices or other pro bono attorneys or attorneys generally to understand what their rights are. Next slide. Why do we need to prevent eviction? For obvious reasons, but also because it has significant consequences that result in high community and healthcare expenditures. Renters with an eviction on their record are often blacklisted by landlords, even if the tenant won the case. What this means is that they receive failing credit scores, and they're often forced into housing with substandard conditions that poses a threat to their health and their safety. Eviction, it is widely proven in particular, almost always leads to a downward move, to rundown housing, to a more disadvantaged, higher crime neighborhood. And studies overwhelmingly demonstrate that eviction is linked to unemployment, to residential instability, homelessness, academic decline, and numerous negative health consequences and chronic health conditions for adults and children alike. And these outcomes cost the community and taxpayers far more than the price of solving the housing affordability crisis itself. And that's widely documented in studies on homelessness and housing instability. I think it's important to note while we're looking at this list of outcomes that tenants are not the only ones who will be affected by eviction. They will feel the greatest brunt of it and suffer the health effects and all the negative consequences. But also when rent payments decline, and this is happening across the country and will happen in even greater numbers once the unemployment insurance runs out on July 25th, so too do property tax and mortgage payments. Building maintenance is deferred, employee salaries are not paid, foreclosure is initiated, and these declining rent payments are most likely to affect small landlords who, like their renters, do not have the financial cushion or the ability to ride out the pandemic. So we will very quickly see ripple effects of eviction, of non-payment of rent in communities across the country, from the actual property taxes to the school systems. And we know that this is happening largely in low-income communities, in communities of color that were already at a deficit in those areas because of the disinvestment and lack of community development that we've seen historically and today. So this is very important to pay attention to right now and to try and prevent, especially in this pandemic environment. So what are we going to do? Next slide, please. First, it's critical to pause the eviction timeline. This is a picture of the Eviction Lab's scorecard, the COVID-19 housing policy scorecard. And the most effective eviction moratorium pauses every stage of the eviction process. So those first 3 categories on the top row, but it's also coupled with short-term supports that enable tenants to ride out the storm, as well as landlords. So foreclosure moratoriums, grace periods to pay rent, making sure that utilities are not disconnected, as well as tenancy preservation measures. And this is everything from providing legal counsel to tenants who are already in the eviction process, but also, most importantly, providing rent relief and rental assistance to pay the rent to ensure that we can preserve housing and really address housing stabilization. You can see Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Delaware are currently the top scorers and have really implemented model approaches, but even their moratoriums are about to expire, like Connecticut's next week. So critical to stay on top of these and to issue these types of moratoriums. There's next slide. I just want to point out a resource in the interest of time. So this is from evictioninnovation.org. Before the pandemic started, Eviction Innovation, which is a lab from the D School and the law school at Stanford University, they have been collecting best practices before an eviction, during an eviction, after eviction, even before the pandemic started. So in your own communities, if you're looking for ways to intervene and to stop this process or to reform eviction so that it is more equitable, or even to stop eviction altogether, this is a really great place to look and to start that exploration. Also, the National Housing Law Project and National Low Income Housing Coalition have developed best practices in the pandemic, both monetary and non-monetary, as well as federal response. So those are great resources to check out. Okay, next slide, please. I did want to just mention briefly enhancing the court process. Because we're moving so quickly to remote hearings, to be very clear, the goal is to prevent ever reaching this stage and to ensure that we avoid eviction altogether, that the filing is never on a tenant's record, that we have worked out the non-payment of rent or the back rent before this gets to this stage. But once there are so many cases that are currently in the queue that we have to improve our representation of tenants, the recovery of rent for the property owners to address this issue, and also reform. And that includes sealing eviction records so that that does not affect their credit, and ensuring access to justice. And Victor, I'm not clear on the question, so if you could just retype it, I can respond to it. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out health justice approach. You can switch the slide. In the pandemic environment, approaching this through a health justice framework can help us weather this storm. And this really requires a few priorities and adhering to certain principles. The first is ensuring that we are actually addressing the social determinants of poor health for low-income communities, communities of color, and other socially subordinated groups that put them at a deficit when the pandemic began. The second is interventions that mandate healthy behavior, such as social distancing, must be accompanied by immediate legal, social, and financial protections and supports to facilitate those behaviors. So if we're going to ask people to shelter in place, we have to ensure that their home is safe, that they have healthy conditions, that they are able to pay the rent, and that their utilities are on. And then finally, because emergencies exacerbate long-standing and interconnected crises for socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, legal and policy responses must focus on addressing the root problems. And the pandemic, it highlighted those, it magnified them, it brought them to the surface. So we know where we need to start to address those additional needs. Finally, what's not on here, but must be a part of any response, is engagement of affected communities. People who are most affected by this issue know best what interventions will work in their lives. And so they must be at the table and engaged in the process. I will pass it on to the next presenter, but I'll be happy to answer questions later on.
Thank you so much, Emily and Alieza, providing that national backdrop to set the stage for Charisse's conversation about eviction prevention efforts happening in Baltimore City.
Hi, again, this is Charisse Liu with the Public Justice Center. I forgot my pronouns before, it's she, her, hers. And so today I'm gonna highlight what's going on in Baltimore City. Like she said, those are the national numbers and what's going on nationally, and it's certainly happening in Baltimore. So I'm gonna scope it on into the right to counsel to Baltimore. addressing the civil rights issues of eviction in the wake of COVID-19. So right before COVID hit, we were studying, working with two groups, Dr. Tim Thomas and Stout Reeses Ross, LLC, for two reports, to commission two reports. One that gave us what's going on, what are the numbers in eviction, how many filings, how many people being evicted per year. The other report, Dr. Thomas's report, was who is being evicted, what gender, what are the demographics. Not surprisingly, the population most hit by evictions, most harmed by evictions, are Black women. Baltimore City itself is at a rate of 5.3%. The national average was about 2.7. So Baltimore is higher, almost double what the national average is, which is high in itself. Annually, there are 140 eviction filings, but there are only 125,000 renter households. So over 100% in eviction filings of the amount of households that are renters. There are 70,000 eviction warrants. So annually, 70,000 homes are at the risk of eviction. 6,500 families are actually evicted. The number of evictions of Black women is 296% more, or 3.9 times higher than evictions of white men. Dr. Tim Thomas says racial disparity makes eviction a civil rights issue linked to the legacy of segregation and housing practices directed against persons of color. 7.3% of all Black male-headed households and 5.4% of all Black female-headed households were removed from their homes in 2019. These rates are roughly 51% and 11% higher than white male-headed eviction rates. This is the infamous Baltimore butterfly. The Baltimore butterfly tells you so much. It tells you health conditions, it tells you poverty conditions, food deserts, low education levels, high death rates, high maternal mortality rates, all match up with this same butterfly, and eviction rates with this same butterfly. As you see, the extremely high is the darker red, the wings of the butterfly. It matches up with every other statistic that we have. The less red is the high, and beyond that, above normal and normal. And as you see, those are actually the minority neighborhoods, minority and low income neighborhoods that surround the inner city. The map shows that the highest risk of eviction occurs in the most segregated neighborhoods to the west and in the gentrifying neighborhoods to the east. The eviction crisis. So the eviction crisis was obviously happening before COVID. Maryland is moving towards 25% unemployment and may have even surpassed that at this point. A 20% delinquency rate in the month of April, and it has surpassed that in May and June. With no clear additional relief from the feds or the state. We all know now that eviction is a public health issue. It has always been, and COVID has just exacerbated that. It just proves the point how public health and eviction are certainly linked. Forcing thousands of families into the street during a pandemic is not the answer. One of the key components to preventing eviction is right to counsel. So moving towards right to counsel, the Stout report showed us that if Maryland and Baltimore invest $5.7 million, Maryland and Baltimore would save $35.6 million in costs. Obviously, these numbers don't show what's the cost to families and families, children, women, when they are evicted, loss of home, loss of jobs, loss of income, mental health, physical health, like my client would have explained if the technology didn't break down. But just in cost, in dollars and cents, Baltimore spent $7.7 million in foster care spending, $12.5 million in Medicaid spending on emergency room and inpatient care, $2.4 million in cost to Baltimore City schools transporting homeless students, $2.3 million in in-state funding lost to Baltimore City schools because of chronically absent homeless students, $10.6 million for shelter, transitional housing, and health institutions. So these are the numbers that the reduction of people being evicted, this is what Maryland and Baltimore would save if they had a right to counsel. 7.7 million in foster care. Go on. Go on. Go ahead. Go ahead. So this is it. Benefits by the numbers, 624%. For every $1 spent on right to counsel, there's a cost avoidance of $6.24. There's a cost avoidance to the city of 17.5 million, a cost avoidance to Maryland of 18.1 million, and 5,777 families would be saved a year. 17,300 people would avoid disruptive displacement. And these are for legal evictions. There are still a lot of illegal evictions in Baltimore. Currently, 80% of the eviction filings, the tenants have a legal defense, but only 8% successfully raise the defense without representation. 96% of landlords are represented in Baltimore, and only 1% of the tenants are represented in Baltimore. Now, to give a little background with this, in Baltimore City, the rent court office is not a nice place. Tenants are often not listened to. They often do not have the chance to present evidence, even if it's physical evidence in their hand. They don't get to speak. They don't get to object. They don't get to show anything. They're up there for seconds. And in seconds, they receive a judgment. With right to counsel, with someone by their side, they may not even hit the eviction court. And if they do, they have someone speaking up for them. Next slide. 92% of tenants with representation avoid disruptive displacements. Legal counsel holds landlords accountable to comply with new laws around COVID to protect renters. So, in March, there was a push through many organizations, including the Public Justice Center, BREW, Maryland Renters United, Access to Justice, United Workers, CASA, and we pushed for Maryland to have a moratorium on evictions. It did not. Baltimore City did. And the courts eventually closed down due to COVID. But what happened in between was landlords trying to evict tenants immediately in the panic, or press upon them to pay more money and scare them. Now we are fighting for rental assistance, in which we got Baltimore City has dedicated now $13 million due to organizing, $13 million towards rental assistance for those impacted by COVID only. That is a small amount of money for the amount of people who need help. And we are pushing the state for over $100 million. But what is also happening is the landlords are seeking for the rental assistance while still evicting tenants, trying to evict tenants through tenant holding over or breach of lease. Next slide. Next slide. The route to counsel has been done in other places. In New York City was the first. In the zip codes where there was a right to counsel, the evictions dropped by 29%. 84% of the represented tenants remained in their homes. 29% is double the amount of avoided evictions in comparison to the zip codes that do not have the right to counsel yet in New York City. These are just a list of the jurisdictions that either have the right to counsel or are fighting for the right to counsel. how does the city or state pay for it? Like we said, we got the 13 million in the CDBG, and a portion of that money we did win in order for it to be dedicated towards right to counsel for people impacted by COVID. That's not enough, but it's something. Legislation at the city level to create the right, detail who is eligible, specify phased implementation similar to Philly and New York, and create accountability mechanisms. Legislation at the state level to provide a portion of the funding for local jurisdictions that adopt a right to counsel. Next slide. And this is just the contact information for BREW, Jews United for Justice, Access to Justice Commission, and the Public Justice. And like we said, so since then, we have had to lobby the courts we are trying to keep the courts closed, maintain the moratorium on evictions. But as of right now, July 25th, everything opens up, everything lifts. And it starts all over again. With the unemployment numbers what they are, it starts all over again during this pandemic. We are working with coalitions like BREW, Maryland Renters United, CASA, to get the moratorium or cancel rent. And that's where we are in Maryland and Baltimore. Thank you.
I'll turn Armen to speak about his work at the HIV Project.
Good afternoon again, everyone. Again, Armen Merjian at the HIV Law Project and Housing Works here in New York. I want to talk first about a community we haven't talked about yet, and that is a community facing a crisis that's not imminent or impending, but that has long been with us, and that is that of homelessness, which is obviously what will result from this crisis if we don't deal with it with regard to eviction. But in New York, that crisis has been here for the longest of times. There are 60,000 homeless human beings here in New York City, staggering figure, because we have failed abjectly to invest in and to maintain low-income housing for folks, grossly disproportionately Black and brown, like everything else you're hearing about today, sadly, socioeconomic, racist factors visiting the worst of all issues, homelessness upon Black and brown people disproportionately. We have that here in spades here in New York because we have a horribly gentrified and increasingly gentrifying city with no real measures to make sure that housing is preserved for low-income folks. What does that mean then for homeless people, particularly here in the COVID-19 crisis? How are homeless people housed? Homeless people are housed in congregate shelters. Congregate is a fancy name for shared or group shelters, an epidemiological nightmare. If you could think of the worst thing you could possibly do for people and for homeless people with regard to housing, it would be to line them up all next to each other on cots and on open beds in a shelter. And that's what homeless people have faced here in New York. Social distancing is impossible. And if housing is healthcare, then homeless housing is toxic medicine. And that's what homeless people have been facing here in New York. A new study is already bearing this out. The mortality rate for homeless people in New York has already been shown to be 61% higher than the general population. And that's deaths of people. That's very real suffering and death. And I think that number is, if anything, low because of the underreporting of deaths and of everything with regard to homeless people. The problem has been compounded here in New York by a few things. Number one, the drop-in centers to which homeless folks have availed themselves have either, my information is, have either closed or are places that folks are understandably avoiding because they are congregate. They are not socially distanced as well. And so what we saw in New York is a lot of homeless folks to stay safe and to distance found themselves going into the subway. Nothing else was open. Other places would have been unsafe. And so you found in the subways folks who are homeless socially distancing themselves with all of their goods on the subway. New York then announced that it was going to address that, although ostensibly also it was going to clean subways by closing the subways at night. So we have in New York City that one place of refuge for homeless folks taken away. Every night the subways are closed and homeless people are kicked out. And as a result, they're forced either onto the street or into congregate shelters. But there is a small silver lining here. We've heard so much that's gloom and doom, and understandably so. We need to raise the hue and cry. But there is one piece of good news, and that is New York has stepped up. Because what do we see in cities throughout America and in cities throughout New York? Sadly, we see hotels left and right completely empty. There is no tourism. There is no demand for hotels. I say sadly, it's sad, it's unjust, it's outrageous that we have people suffering from COVID and dying and homeless right outside of these wonderful buildings that are completely empty, fallow, not being used. It is a symbol of our injustice and inhumanity that we allow any room to go unused while someone is suffering and dying. New York did step up, and New York is running some of those lovely hotels as COVID-19 shelters for homeless people. I'm pleased to say that Housing Works is running one of these homeless shelters, and we say shelter, but it's individual rooms, single room occupancy hotels, names I won't mention, but big names, where homeless folks at risk for or testing positive for COVID can shelter and can recover. And here's the key. In addition, it's not just a place to sleep and to lay one's head, but we are putting folks in touch with a constellation of services, which is what poor folks, which is what folks who are ill or folks who are homeless need. They need a continuum of care. And so they can get not only a place to lay their head, but they can get put in touch with medical services. They can get food services. They can get psychosocial case management, which is so important in this crisis. And one then raises the question, what are we doing nationwide and who is looking out for homeless folks? Are we taking over these hotels and are we putting folks who are suffering and dying disproportionately into these hotels, particularly when they're not even being used? And to the extent that the city and state governments reimburse the hotel owners, it's a win-win for everyone. But more than a win-win, it's a matter of basic justice and humanity. And so the question is nationwide, are we doing that? Are we filling up these empty hotel rooms? None of them should be empty when human beings are suffering. Turning then to one of our specialties, which is folks living with HIV and AIDS, there's also a bit of success story there because a combination of legislation and lawsuits have provided a much better situation for folks who are homeless and living with HIV and AIDS. In 1997, we passed a law, Local Law 49, that requires the provision of medically appropriate emergency housing for homeless folks. It was signed, believe it or not, by then Mayor Giuliani in 1997. And what that means, among other things, is to be medically appropriate, one has to have one's own room, which is so important to socially distancing oneself during the COVID-19 crisis. We've then had to turn around and sue Mayor Giuliani repeatedly to make improvements that have made things so much better. First, in the Hanna versus Turner case, we established that people have a right to same-day placement in emergency housing that is medically appropriate, which is the first ruling of its kind in America. And so if you're homeless and living with HIV or AIDS, you're immediately placed in a single room occupancy hotel. And number two, we then brought a lawsuit to make sure that minimal habitable conditions exist, because so many of these hotels at the time were substandard, and we've brought them, I think, much better to speed on what they should be. Again, nationwide, it's something that I hope other jurisdictions will practice. All of this is set forth, by the way, in the National Treatise on AIDS, AIDS in the Law, Chapter 6, sets forth some of those landmark cases for homeless people living with HIV, which have now proven so important to keeping people alive. And to the extent that people have tested positive for HIV or have revealed their status in the general homeless population, we have then been able to get them into the hotels more permanently until they find permanent housing, whether they're living with COVID or not, because under the law, they must be housed. I'll speak finally with regard to the impending eviction crisis here in New York, particularly for our folks living with HIV and AIDS who are poor or low income. What we have found, and it's no great surprise, is that people who are low income and living with HIV or AIDS have been the first to be let go, because they are working in what are considered expendable or high-risk jobs. They're in the service industry. They're security guards. Some of my clients are working in rental car companies or in the hotel industry, and they've all been laid off since March. The problem there is then they have, under federal law, been required to pay 30% of their income towards rent. And thankfully in New York, we wrote a law that mirrors the federal law with regard to the 30% income, so that even in private apartments in New York, folks who are living with HIV and AIDS are only required to pay 30% of their income and the rest is covered by city and state. The idea is the same as was behind the national law, which was at first 25 and now 30%, and that is that people shouldn't have to choose between food and clothing and medicine and so forth and their rent, something that increasingly, as you saw from the earlier charts, Americans are having to do, dedicating an overwhelming amount of their income towards rent, leaving very little else. And Matthew Desmond covers this very comprehensively in his Pulitzer Prize winning Evicted as well. So what we're seeing then is since March, with no income, 30% of nothing is nothing. And so we are fearing this tsunami that's coming down the pike. New York has just lifted the moratorium. And so we've just begun with eviction proceedings remotely. And we know it's going to hit the fan, and it's going to hit the fan really hard. With individuals who weren't working but had other income like veterans checks, SSI, SSD, they too have had to pay 30% nationwide in federal programs, and here, whether federal or in private housing. And of course, there are all kinds of reasons why they would have had trouble over the last several months paying. Increased utility costs, increased food costs. Folks don't think about it, but poor people often get food at programs that they attend, programs that have been closed because of social distancing. So food and utilities, now that the summer is here as well, and the hot months with air conditioners, or buying an air conditioner where you didn't have one with the little extra money that you had, a confluence of factors is going to lead poor folks to not have the money, or low-income folks to pay. We're seeing that in huge numbers. And so one of the keys there is, of course, we need a bailout, and I'll speak finally about that, but we all, and frankly, better than a bailout would be a cancellation, which would be lovely. But we need to rebudget folks, because the moment that they stopped having income, those who are working, for example, a full share should have been paid, and they should be rebudgeted to show that they don't have to pay 30% of anything because they have no income. That will be key. But also will be key for the governments to come forward and do some sort of Marshall Plan, some major bailout of people. We are going to see profound suffering and death of families, of the disabled, of elderly, of children, of everyone, because of this massive eviction crisis that we have. If we can bail out banks and insurance companies and bail out the rich, as we've seen so many of these bailouts help, then we can certainly bail out huge numbers of Americans, poor and low income, and through what I hope is a forgiveness program, not merely a loan or a moratorium, but a program to ensure going forward that they don't face arrears, that those arrears are either canceled or fully satisfied through a Marshall Plan, which is what this country is going to need. So I'll conclude there, and again, happy to take questions with the rest of the panelists, and I thank you for your time.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Armen. So now if we've been able to troubleshoot, I would like to turn to LM, if she is able to join us to speak to her lived experience, navigating some of what you've just touched on, in fact.
Hi, I have her on the phone. Is it okay if I do it that way?
Perfect, yes, thank you so much. Thank you again for your patience with us troubleshooting and for joining us and being willing to share about what you've experienced.
I'm going to put you on now, Ellen. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, how you doing? I hope you all are well through this pandemic. I filed an escrow against my landlord last year due to issues that needed to be repaired in the home. He refused to make the repairs and never came to court.
We're hearing a bit of an echo.
If I mute, you have to mute your computer. Mute your computer.
Unmute my computer?
Yes.
Okay. Is it mute now?
I think so. But if I mute, then you can't hear. Then you can't hear her.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Now, go ahead and start.
Oh, perfect.
She's going to call in, if that's okay.
So I'm happy to turn to questions if this feels like an appropriate time to pivot to that while we troubleshoot. Or Charisse, if you would like to share about what your client has experienced.
I can, and I'm so sorry that the technology isn't working. If I could be in person, I would be able to help better, but we can't. So my client, she had an escrow due to habitability issues right before COVID. The court ordered that she pay into the escrow, even though the landlord has never showed up or never responded to the city, never responded to anyone. But it's a very friendly, landlord-friendly court. She paid. As soon as COVID hit, the landlord started really inappropriate confrontations, sent men to her door, multiple groups of men to her door, intimidating her, met her at her car when she comes home at night from work, demanded that not only does she pay into the escrow, but she pay him directly in excess of the amount of rent, which she did because she got scared. LM, are you on the phone? We can't hear you. I was just going to explain what's going on. So various acts of intimidation, and that happened a lot when COVID hit. Landlords panicked and began to intimidate their tenants. LM is another person that it's happening to. He continuously has excuses to enter the home, including bringing someone in who then later called my client and told them that they tested positive for COVID. So they then had to quarantine, her and her family had to quarantine themselves because of someone that the landlord brought into the property without checking first if he was tested positive and without having face coverings or anything. And that's what's going on. So far we're still fighting it. He also sent her, now that I got involved, he also sent her a notice to vacate in the middle of the pandemic. So he's trying to intimidate her to have to leave. And this is common of what people are going through, different harassment during this time. They're panicking, but landlords are used to getting their way here. And so they're acting in terribly inappropriate ways, but ways that we've seen before. So thank you, and I'm sorry about the technology.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate everyone's patience as we have been trying to navigate this. It has been raised in the chat that this illustrates just how many barriers to access to justice, access to the courts we collectively will be facing. And it has also been identified that there have been internet outages in Baltimore throughout the day. So that may be what we're facing. Thank you so much, Charisse, for describing the situation that you and LM are working on right now. I think now is a great time to pivot to questions from the audience. And so one question that I personally found interesting, I see that Alieza has suggested that we continue the discussion about technology as a barrier. One question that folks seem to be asking a lot is why are rents continuing to go up? I don't know if anyone has a short answer for that.
I'll take a stab at it. I mean, a whole host of factors. First of all, and most importantly, does your jurisdiction have a rent stabilization or rent control program? Without one, then landlords are free to choose whatever rent they want to choose, right? If we leave these critical issues for poor and low-income people to the market and to the profit margin, which is what we're talking about in the private market, then we're at the behest of folks who are trying to make money. I mean, most landlords are using their property to obtain wealth, and they're going to charge whatever they can. We have in the United States a position as well, a situation in which the earlier white flight, where white folks fled from inner cities, now somehow deem cities to be safer places to live, and they've come back in because of racism and socioeconomic issues. They have more money, there's a greater demand. Obviously, populations continue to rise. And so we have the gentrifying of neighborhoods. Neighborhoods in New York that heretofore were ones in which we could safely assure our clients that they could find an affordable rent are becoming unaffordable because money is moving in. And sadly, because of racism, that money is disproportionately white. So what we're seeing in the inner cities is where we used to have white flight and lower rents, we have money moving in, and as a result, we have rents going up. In addition, we have rent stabilization and rent control, but there are various ways and loopholes, some of them recently closed by the state legislature, in which landlords can then raise those rents. And once they're raised and go to what the market will demand, it will go through the roof. So it's about the market, it's about demand, it's about, again, this is a Black Lives Matter issue, it's about racial justice, because we're talking about inner cities that white folks didn't want to live in before, and now they do want to live in them. And when they do, they come, and with the greater ability to pay rent, landlords are kicking out Black and brown folks who have lived there for generations, for decades, and it is creating an unbelievable problem. That's just one of the many issues. But again, I think it all comes back to the profit motive. But that's my call.
Yeah, I'd like to just echo Armen there for a moment, because I mean, there are actually very few places in the United States that have rent stabilization laws or rent control laws. It, is mostly limited to New York, to Washington, D.C., parts of California, and I think Massachusetts. So that is the fact that rents are rising is partly due to the fact that we treat housing as a commodity as opposed to something that can and should be a human right. Evictions and homelessness are a phenomenon that have been allowed to occur by choice because the United States has not invested in affordable or low income housing the way that other countries have. So it's certainly something that is within our power to change. We don't necessarily need to treat these things as natural phenomena. And we know from historical accounts from the Great Depression, for instance, that evictions were quite rare at other moments of US history, that often neighborhoods would band together to move people's belongings back into their apartment after the sheriff had removed them. So, it's a social construct in the way that, there are many other types of injustice that we have lived with for too long, and we absolutely can and should reverse moving forward.
And just to piggyback on what she just said, here in Baltimore, we have a strange dichotomy of empty neighborhoods and homelessness and high rates of eviction. So we have plenty of homes that are empty, but high rates of eviction and homelessness and high rent. Income here, particularly for minority population, has not gone up since like the 1980s. Rates of pay have not gone up, but rent continues to go up. The problem is a lot of these properties and property owners have not invested money back into those properties either. The homes are just older, in more disrepair, and yet charging higher rents. There's no relief. There's no standard. And the market, when they say market rate, I would even say that that's speculative, because how is that the market rate? And so, like you said, this is from the United States, not treating housing like a human right and not regulating it like we would natural resources, like we need to for food and water. This is a human right.
And just sorry, I want to build off of, Charisse just really hit the nail on the head. We actually have research that my colleague Mac Desmond did from a couple of years ago that showed that the profit margins in rental housing are highest in low income neighborhoods. So as we think about what we expect of tenants, what we expect of landlords amidst a pandemic and global economic crisis, we really need to question the ways in which our housing is structured, what we expect low income Americans to pay. And I think that part of the reason that wages have stagnated is because a lot of the work that is essential to our daily functioning is historically undervalued in our economy. As we think about, the home health aides, as we think about, people that work in grocery stores, people that, work in hospitals that may not have access to healthcare, they may not have access to paid sick days or paid family leave. These are the jobs that are traditionally done by workers of color. So, the pandemic is really hitting us where it hurts, in a lot of the economy that people have been underpaid for so long. So when we think about, healthcare jobs, childcare work, the invisible labor that makes life rewarding and also keeps the economy running, I think that'll be part of, the solution of how we sort of, address this moving forward.
Great, thank you all. I think you answered one of the other questions that I wanted to get. So I'll pivot to another question, which is going off of Alieza's comment about illegal evictions and the illustrated impact of providing counsel to those facing eviction. Doesn't it seem when legal counsel would provide that much of a significant difference, that there's an issue with the judicial system at large?
So I will just say yes. 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 And
yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
yes. And is the rent court system, at least where I am, but I think all over, is it there to subsidize or to support this one industry?
Yeah, and we can give specific details and statistics that bear that out. I mean, the New York City housing courts were founded in the 1970s, in fact, with the idea that they needed to make housing safe and habitable. Remember that in the early days of American law, you didn't even have a right to complain. If your ceiling fell in, it was let the renter beware. And then slowly we had this concept of what we call a warrant of habitability that came into play, and that landlords had to make sure that things were habitable. And so they set up in New York a special court to say, we want to enforce that warrant of habitability. We want to make sure that places are safe. But from that initial thought, they added, oh, and we'll make it also a place where landlords can sue. And that has turned into basically a collection service for landlords. In a 5-year period, for example, in New York, there were 116,000 people evicted and families, 116,000. In that same period, there were fewer than 50 contempt motions against landlords for widespread violations of basic habitability standards. We're talking about probably hundreds of thousands, 116,000 people evicted, 50 contempt motions. In fact, there's a new law review article that's going to be coming out about this because the dichotomy is huge. So the answer is yes, the courts are completely skewed. And when you add the wonderful statistics that my co-panelists have shared about folks who overwhelmingly, where there's no right of counsel, have no lawyer, then you see that it's a recipe for disaster. A court system already skewed against poor people, landlords over 90% represented, and poor folks not represented, or even working class folks not represented at all. You can imagine how that's skewed.
Yeah, and I would say certainly like we're exploring together with Emily the ways in which the courts could be restructured. For instance, like if we think about like whether rental debt should be separated out from an eviction itself, for instance, are there ways that we can support the idea that everyone deserves a home and not just shelter? I mean, to Armen's point, having a roof, having your roof cave in or like a hole in your kitchen floor, like that is not home. That might be shelter, but it is certainly inadequate shelter. So if I'm ever optimistic about our current moment, I hope that we can come together to think about how to promote this idea of home for all. How can we, create a court system and other systems within our policy frameworks that would promote home, particularly for those who have been most historically marginalized in our society.
Thank you. This is a question that was first put in the chat, but moved over to the Q&A that I would love to hear an answer for if anyone has one. And the question is, how are undocumented tenants being supported during this time? The person who asked the question added, I know in the state of Minnesota, there are little to no resources for many of our undocumented families and individuals.
Well, we should first acknowledge just how hard this is hitting undocumented folks. Folks who cannot rely on even accumulated vacation time, who are often working off of the books, who are seeking jobs often on a corner, gathered with others and hoping to be enlisted that day and not being enlisted, or working in industries, again, service and other industries that have closed since March. So, and of course, again, with statistics we've seen, having no cushion, which is such an important thing too, having no savings, having no ability to weather this storm. So it's a huge issue. There are also undocumented folks who are waiting. There's a backlog in immigration to get their work authorization so that they can lawfully work. And until they have lawful work authorization, they can't even derive an income. So I wanted to just first frame that folks are being extremely hard hit. Who are undocumented. I can say that we certainly serve all who are clients of our organization, regardless of immigration status. But I'll let the other panelists talk about their jurisdictions and their ideas.
Same here. We serve all. There's CASA, there's the Public Justice Center, and the other organizations, PBRC, Homeless People's Representation Project. Where I really see the problem with it is not so much once they get to an attorney or get into the legal system, which is bad in itself, just being part of eviction. It actually here, the landlords have intimidated the undocumented tenant so much, they never get to us. It doesn't even get to the filing because our housing policies are so toxic, and the relationship between landlords and tenant, it's such a power differential that they actually are terrified of their landlord in a bigger way than we can imagine. So they sometimes never get, they do it sometimes, but not enough get to us because they just surrender to whatever it is that the landlord wants, and it never gets to us.
And that speaks to the fact that the number of evictions that are reported hugely underreport, because all the landlord has to do, and they do it every day, and it's disgusting, is say, I'm going to call the government on you. I know you don't have papers, and so you need to leave. And what are they going to do? Challenge them in court? They leave. That is an eviction that never went through the courts. It never went through a marshal. It's not captured in the statistics, and yet it ruined a family's life.
And I suspect the landlords here, they do it to anyone with a record. They do it to anyone who's undocumented. Many evictions happen here without going through the court process. So yes.
Yeah, I want to just echo both of those. And I put this in the chat box, but we know for instance that, if 3.7 million Americans faced an eviction filing in 2016 prior to COVID-19, and we also know that informal or illegal evictions are happening at double the rate of the formal process, that absolutely, this hits undocumented and immigrant communities particularly hard. It also hits families struggling with domestic violence or gender-based violence particularly hard. So, I think part of why my colleague Emily emphasized the importance of freezing or making illegal sort of that notice to tenants, if we're able to create barriers or repercussions to landlords putting pressure on their tenants, I think that's certainly something that we need to sort of consider, in addition to policies that we can put into place that don't require people to verify their status in the United States. So as we think about aid moving forward, we shouldn't be asking people that question. We should just be asking how to support them having a home. How do we make sure that they're safe and in place, particularly for communities that have historically faced brutality by the state itself?
Thank you. I think that you just touched on the next question, which is, are there targeted efforts to provide additional housing supports for domestic violence victims and survivors during the COVID pandemic?
I'm going to go with no. I really am. I don't. I would say that this region was not prepared to deal with any housing issues. Um, I will give credit to the shelters themselves, the Family Crisis Center in our area, um, and a few other shelters, House of Ruth, of course. They set up a system and worked with the counties to set up a system for hotels for quarantine, and then clients could come in to the shelter. So they did set up an infrastructure once they could. But in preparation or housing at all due to domestic violence, no, there's not enough resources. There's not enough resources at all.
And keep in mind, in cities, one of the big problems is that, again, cities where heretofore there wasn't a huge demand for rooms, for tourist rooms, have seen a rise in tourism. New York in the last 15, 20 years has seen a tremendous increase in tourism. And so places, single room occupancy hotels, they're really dumps, but at least they're a hotel with one's own room, were available. They said to the city, send us folks, because at least we're going to get money doing that and we'll house folks. And that's where a domestic violence victim can bring her family, her children to shelter while looking for a new place, while getting back on one's feet, while getting supportive services. But the cities have watched as these habitats have been turned into for-profit tourist hotels. And another one bites the dust, and one after another, hotels that at least provided single rooms for folks become tourist hotels, because the cities are not investing in securing these, what should be supportive housing units for folks who need them. And if you leave it to the market, that's what's going to happen, because we have a country in which the S word is horrible. Anything is socialist in which the government is becoming involved. If the government doesn't become involved to protect people, the market's not going to. That's what we're looking at.
Yeah, and violence against women and gender-based violence are two of the leading causes of homelessness among families with children. So as we think about our response, absolutely, like this was a system that was already underfunded prior to COVID-19. So it certainly should be a part of any policy response. But that again is a legacy of racism and patriarchy in our society that we need to change. I have, certainly worked with social service firms in New York in particular. There's an organization called Her Justice that does provide representation in immigration and domestic violence cases that does great work. There are many around the country, but of course they need more support. So certainly as we think about the ways in which people have sort of intersecting identities and vulnerabilities in this time, we need a overly generous response to ensure that we weather and emerge from the crisis itself.
So for the sake of time, I'm going to collapse a few questions. A few folks in the chat have been asking what families, what individuals can do to fight raises in rent. And then another question, to paraphrase, is legislation and legislative changes and that process the most effective process to become involved with to change the requirements for eviction and to strengthen renter protections?
I'm happy to lead off. I can think of several different things, right? First of all, we need a right to counsel. We need a civil Gideon. That's the famous case that provided a right to counsel in criminal cases. We need a civil Gideon for housing court. And we need to get behind legislation and funding for that. We need to get behind legislation and funding for supportive housing and for housing programs, vouchers and subsidies. It is horribly underfunded in this country, and it's getting worse. The backlog, as you've heard, for people waiting for vouchers and subsidies is enormous. It's insane. We need to invest in it. We also need to amend the Fair Housing Act to add lawful source of income as a protected category. Poor folks, just in short, we waited until 1968 to finally say that you can't discriminate based on race and other issues in housing, an insane 400-year wait. Unfortunately, they didn't add lawful source of income, a voucher or a subsidy, to the protections in the federal law. At the same time, we moved to vouchers and subsidies and away from project-based housing for poor folks and low-income folks. And so what happened? when in cities, disproportionately Black and brown people came and said, I have a Section 8 voucher, I can pay the rent you're asking. Landlords turned around and used source of income discrimination as a proxy for race and disability and other discrimination. Said, oh no, we love the Black folks, we don't love the Section 8 program. And it became a subterfuge. And it's still not protected under the federal law, despite switching to a largely voucher-based program. And finally, rent control and rent stabilization. How do you control rents from going up? Pass rent control and rent stabilization legislation. Those are my quick ideas.
Everything he said, and I would say take the issue of housing out of the rent court. I think that it's a subsidized debt collection service. It's such an easy process that anyone can be a landlord. And for something so important, it has absolutely no standard to do this. And so it doesn't even, to me, doesn't even make financial sense, the steps that they take, the behavior that they have. But that would be number one. Number two, I would actually say, for a while, except for all of us involved in housing, it wasn't sexy enough for a national call. And I think now it's time where we need to make a national call for some level of, like I said, stabilization, basic standards for what is rentable. And I would actually advocate that some of this comes from the fact that women can work 40-hour weeks and still not have enough to live and rent somewhere. So we need increase in wages, not more hours, increase in wages. Because many of the people I meet are working people, and yet they can't stay in one home at a time. Any flat tire, any child has an accident, child even has a field trip that the school wanted money for, throws off their budget completely. These were our essential workers that kept us stable during this time. It's time for us to see it holistically and fight for this holistically.
Yeah, no, I want to just echo everything that Charisse and Armen have said, and just say that in addition to that, I think that we should be talking about very generous cash benefits to families across the United States right now. It's something that Canada's doing, that countries across Europe are doing, and it is allowing their citizens to eat food every day, to pay their gas bill, to stay in their home, and to provide a measure of stability to their families and communities. So certainly, yes, we need to amend our housing laws and court system, but I think that is a form of support that that shouldn't be forgotten just because it hasn't been done before in any great way in the United States. This is a crisis of historic proportions, and it demands a historic response.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone's answers. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to wrap up questions and quickly just share these resources for folks who do not know. Today's presentation was put together by the Civil Rights and Social Justice section of the ABA. If you're interested in joining, you can do that. There are so many other wonderful and timely programs being put together by this section. You can find out more information on their website. I would like to thank everyone for joining us and tuning in, and for being patient as we have navigated technical difficulties. And I'd like to also thank our esteemed panelists who are doing such amazing, critical, and necessary work. So thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to be a part of this conversation, and unfortunately, it is a very necessary and timely.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Be well, everyone.